You are listening to a programme from BBC Radio 4.
200 years ago today, one of the most famous battles in history was fought, the Battle of Waterloo. It was there that Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, was finally defeated by the Allied forces of the Seventh Coalition. And yet 2 centuries on, there are still doubts and confusion about what actually happened 12 miles south of Brussels in June 1815. In this programme, I'll be looking to dispel some of the myths that surround this important historical milestone. Napoleon had made a daring escape from the Mediterranean island of Elba some 3 months earlier. Seeing that the puppet king, Louis XVIII, had lost support among the French, Napoleon acted.
Frenchmen, in my exile I heard your complaints and wishes. You were claiming that government of your choice, which alone is legitimate. You were blaming me for my long sleep. So amid all sorts of dangers, I arrived among you to regain my rights, which are yours.
At 1:30 a.m. on the 20th of March, Louis XVIII was lifted into his carriage here at the Tuileries, and he fled Paris. That evening, Napoleon entered the Tuileries once again as de facto Emperor of France. It soon became clear that the Allies weren't going to allow him to retain the throne, and that they would not lay down their arms till he was ousted. One of the biggest myths about Waterloo is that it was a battle won by British arms. And whilst it's true that the campaign was largely financed by British largesse and was led by the Anglo-Irish Duke of Wellington, it was actually a polyglot Anglo-Dutch-Belgian-German force that would face Napoleon, 36% of which was British, but 49% of which spoke German as their first language. Here, in the Royal Hospital in Chelsea, in London, is a large and beautiful panoramic painting of the closing stages of the Battle of Waterloo, painted by George Jones. It depicts the very end of the battle, the glory of the British troops and the crushing defeat of the French army. And my eye is immediately drawn to Wellington. Bathed in a silvery light, he's positioned on rising ground, gesturing to his troops with his hat to advance on the French. But in this painting, we can also see a third army that was present at the Battle of Waterloo. Thousands and thousands of Prussians under Field Marshal Blücher to the left there. The role of the Prussians has often been contested, but the truth is that Wellington would never have given battle there without their support. As he himself said in his Waterloo dispatch,
"I should not do justice to my own feelings or to the Prussian army if I did not attribute the successful result of this arduous day to the cordial and timely assistance I received from them."
Whilst the consequences may have been far-reaching, the battle itself could have gone either way. Wellington himself later described it as
the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life.
Initially, the French outnumbered their opponents, especially in artillery. They'd been victorious 2 days earlier. They were a homogeneous national force, and their morale was high, since they were commanded in person by a general they firmly believed to be the greatest soldier since Julius Caesar. Furthermore, the very first stages of the Waterloo campaign also saw Napoleon returning to the best of his strategic abilities. He wanted to fight in Belgium because the British and Prussian troops were far apart. And capturing Brussels would be a great boost to French morale and might force the British army off the continent. By pulling off a brilliant feint towards the west, he managed to steal a day's march on Wellington, who exclaimed,
"Napoleon has humbugged me, by God."
But then things began to go wrong. Napoleon wanted to strike at the hinge between the Prussian and Anglo-Allied armies, in the way that he'd been doing successfully for nearly 20 years. But at Ligny, Napoleon failed to rout the Prussians because of countermanded orders that went to General d'Erlon, which sent him and 20,000 men marching in the wrong direction.
In war, the game is always with him who commits the fewest faults.
The day before the Battle of Waterloo, on the 17th of June, Napoleon made another two crucial errors. Firstly, he allowed Wellington to retreat from the strategic crossroads at Quatre Bras, where he ought immediately to have fallen upon the Allied forces at first light. Instead, unaccountably, Napoleon wasted precious time reading reports from Paris, visiting the Ligny battlefield, giving directions for the care of the wounded, and then talking to his generals. Meanwhile, Wellington had learnt what had happened at Ligny and was prudently retreating northwards in a thunderstorm, with plenty of time to take up position a few miles south of his headquarters at Waterloo, an area he had previously reconnoitred and which held myriad defensive advantages as a battlefield. These included plenty of hidden ground and two large stone farmhouses called Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte out in front of his lines. Napoleon's second error was to assume that the majority of the Prussian army was retreating in disarray and could play no further significant part in the campaign. He sent off Marshal Grouchy with a large force who failed to stop the Prussians. In fact, the Prussians had decided to stay close to Wellington's army, a move that was to be described by Wellington as the most important decision of the 19th century. At breakfast, Napoleon's brother Jérôme actually told the Emperor that a waiter at the King of Spain Inn, where Wellington had dined on the 16th of June, had overheard a British aide-de-camp saying that the Prussians would join them later. To this devastatingly accurate information, Napoleon replied,
"The Prussians and the English cannot possibly link up for another 2 days after such a battle as Ligny, and given the fact that they are being pursued by a considerable body of troops. The battle that is coming will save France, and will be celebrated in the annals of the world. I shall have my artillery fire and my cavalry charge so as to force the enemy to disclose his positions, and when I am quite certain which positions the English troops have taken up, I shall march straight up them with my old guard."
Because Waterloo was a small battlefield, as we can see from this painting, Napoleon's tactical options were severely limited. The first assault was an attempt to capture the farmhouse of Hougoumont. It failed, and was to suck in more and more French troops as the day progressed, who for some unknown reason failed to smash in the front gates with horse artillery. Wellington reinforced it during the day, and Hougoumont, like the second farmhouse, La Haye-Sainte, became an invaluable breakwater that disrupted and funneled the French advance. When several of the French generals who had fought Wellington in Spain suggested that Napoleon shouldn't rely on being able to break through British infantry with ease, the Emperor replied,
"Because you have been beaten by Wellington, you consider him to be a good general. I say that he's a bad general and that the English are bad troops. It will be a picnic."
Napoleon had further bad luck on the day of the battle, the 18th. There had been heavy rain the previous day, and so his artillery commander had insisted on waiting for the ground to dry before starting the battle, in order to get his guns into place more easily and for the cannonballs to bounce further once fired. It was advice he was to regret for the rest of his life. Had Napoleon started his attack earlier, he would have had more time to break Wellington's line before the Prussians erupted onto his right flank.
Ah, mon Dieu. Perhaps the rain on the 17th of June had more to do than is supposed with the loss of Waterloo.
The major infantry attack that Napoleon finally unleashed came at 1:30 p.m. when General d'Erlon's corps assaulted Wellington's centre-left through muddy fields of breast-high crops of rye, marching past La Haye-Sainte farmhouse on their left in the hope of smashing through and then rolling up each side of Wellington's line. It was the correct place to attack, the weakest part of the enemy position, but again, the execution was faulty. Then, at about 4 p.m, a series of massive cavalry charges totalling over 10,000 men was launched under Marshal Ney and General Guillot against Wellington's centre-right, although it's still unclear quite who, if anyone, ordered it, since it was premature and unsupported by infantry or horse artillery. Wellington's infantry formed 13 hollow oblongs, known as squares, a four-sided hedge of bayonets ready to receive the cavalry, none of which broke. Napoleon admitted in exile on St Helena,
"It was the good discipline of the English that gained the day."
with much of the French cavalry exhausted, its horses blown, and the Prussians arriving in force after 4:15 p.m, Napoleon ought to have withdrawn as best he could, yet he was a gambler. Napoleon ordered Marshal Ney to do whatever it took to capture the walled farm of La Haye-Sainte. Sometime after 6 p.m, Ney succeeded in capturing La Haye-Sainte and the nearby sandpit in the centre of the battlefield and brought up a battery of horse artillery at 300 yards range, allowing him to pound Wellington's centre with musketry and cannon. This was the most dangerous moment in the entire battle for Wellington, and Napoleon's best opportunity to punch a hole in the Anglo-Allied centre before the large-scale arrival of the Prussians sealed his fate. The centre of the Anglo-Allied line wavered momentarily under this terrific onslaught, and this was perhaps the psychological moment at which Napoleon should have flung every available man into the action in front of the farmhouse. Yet when Ney sent his aide-de-camp to beg Napoleon for more troops to exploit the situation, the Emperor refused. He sarcastically replied,
"Troops? Where would you like me to find them? Would you like me to make them?"
In fact, he had 14 Guards battalions at the time, which he ought to have sent into the attack. He failed to do so. It wasn't until 7 p.m, once he had ridden right along the whole battlefront, that Napoleon sent his elite unit, the Imperial Guard, up the main road towards Brussels in an echeloned column. But the sheer concentration of firepower, both musketry and grapeshot, that Wellington was able to bring to bear broke the will of the Imperial Guard at this crucial point, and it fell back, demoralised. The cry, "La Garde recule," had never been heard on a European battlefield before, and it was the sign for a general disintegration of the French army across the entire front. Men threw down their muskets and tried to escape the battlefield. And that's the moment that's captured in this magnificent painting. When it was clear what was happening, Napoleon took one of his generals by the arm and said,
"Come, General, the affair is over. We have lost the day. Let us be off."
There are many myths and rumours about the state of Napoleon's health during the Waterloo campaign. Nevertheless, there is no indication, as some historians have suggested, that he suffered from narcolepsy, or indeed that any decisions he took that day were the result of his hemorrhoids. The real mystery about the Battle of Waterloo is why a collection of fine and experienced French combat generals repeatedly failed to coordinate their efforts on the battlefield. Wellington, by total contrast, had studied Napoleon's tactics and career and was punctilious in his deployments everywhere. Napoleon's failure to coordinate his attacks meant that he very much deserved to lose the Battle of Waterloo. Almost immediately, the battleground became a tourist destination. People came in droves, not just to see the site of Wellington's great victory, but also to witness for themselves the site of Napoleon's great defeat. And tomorrow, I'll look at what history has made of Napoleon, the man and the myths.
You can download many more BBC Radio 4 programmes for free. Find these at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.